In this video, I will show you how to create, read, update, and delete invoices using ASP.NET, Razor Pages, SQL Server, and Entity Framework. So here we have the different invoices, and you can use this button to create a new invoice. And we obtain this form. And to update the invoice, we can click on this Edit button. So here we have the invoice details, and you can update these details. And to delete the invoice, we can use this delete button. Then in the next video, I will show you how to implement the pagination functionality and the search functionality using a JavaScript library. So here we can see that we can switch between the different pages, and we can do a search. And here we have the invoices that belong to this client. Then I will show you how to display an alert before deleting the invoice. So when we click on this delete button, we obtain this alert. If we click on cancel, nothing happens. And if we click on delete, the invoice will be deleted. Also, I will show you how to use the one-to-one and the one-to-many relationships of Entity Framework. So we can click on this edit button, and here we can see that an invoice can have one or multiple invoice items. So we can create a new item, and let's click on submit. So now we can see that we have 3 items in this invoice. And to delete an invoice item, we can use this delete button. You can find the link of the second video in the description. Now let's create a new project. Then here let's select C# and Web. Then we need to select ASP.NET Core Web Application with Razor Pages. So let's select this option, then Next. Let's call the project Invoice App. Then Next. Then here let's select the latest version of the .NET Framework. We will use HTTPS. Then let's click on Create. Then let's create a new connection to the database. So we can click on Server Explorer. Then let's create a new connection. So the server is installed on my computer. So we can write dot or localhost, then slash, then the instance name, which is in my case equal to SQL Express. Then let's check this box to trust the server certificate. And let's create a new database called InvoiceDB, for example. Then OK. Let's click on Yes to create the database. So now we have this new connection. And for the moment we don't have any table. Then we need the connection string, so we can make a right click, then Properties, and let's copy the connection string. Then let's save it in the file appsettings.json. So here let's create a new section, and let's call it connection strings. Then let's create the first connection string. We can call it default connection, for example. And let's paste the connection string. So here we need to remove the spaces. Then we need to install some packages. So let's make a right click on the project, then Manage NuGet Packages, then Browse, and here let's type EF SQL Server. So this package allows us to connect to the SQL Server Database. So let's select it, then Install. Then we need another package called Entity Framework Tools. Let's select this package. So this package allows us to execute these commands on the Package Manager console. So let's install it. Let's close this page. Then let's create the DbContext class that allows us to connect to the database using Entity Framework. So this is a service. So let's create a new folder. And let's call it Services. Then let's create a new class. And let's call it ApplicationDbContext. Then we need to extend the dbContext class of Entity Framework. So here let's add colon, then dbContext. Let's add the namespace. Then we need to create the constructor. So we can use this button, then generate constructor that requires this parameter. Now let's add this class to the service container. So let's go to program.cs. And let's add the ApplicationDbContext to the service container. So just here we can call builder.services.addDbContext. And we will add a dbContext class of type ApplicationDbContext. Then let's provide this method with an arrow function that allows us to configure the ApplicationDbContext. It requires a parameter, we can call it options. Then here we need to read the connection string from the file appsettings.json. So let's create a variable and let's call it connection string. And it is equal to builder.configuration.getConnectionString, and we need to provide this method with the name of the connection string that is available in appsettings.json. So this is the name that we need. Then let's call options.useSQL Server. And let's provide it with the connection string. Now let's create a new model that allows us to read and write the invoices from the database. So let's create a new folder. And let's call it models. Then let's create a new class. And let's call it invoice. Then let's add the different properties. So we need the invoice ID, which will be the primary key. Then we need the invoice number, the status, so it can be either paid or pending. Then we need the issue date, the due date. Then here we have the service details, and here we have the client details. So we have the service name, the unit price, and the quantity. Then we have the client name, the email address, the phone number, and the address. Then let's create a new dbSet property in ApplicationDbContext that allows us to read and write the invoices from the database. So we will create a dbSet of invoice. So the name of this property will be the name of the table in the database. So here we can see that we have a warning because we did not initialize this property. And to get rid of this warning, we can add null exclamation mark. This means that this property will not be null. Now let's create a new migration file. So let's save all the files. Then let's go to Package Manager console. Then here let's call add migration. And let's create a migration file called first migration. So this is the migration file that allows us to create the invoices table in the database. And these are the different columns. Now let's create the table. So we need to call update database. Let's take a look at the database. So we need to refresh the connection. And here we can see that we have this new table. Now let's add some invoices using an SQL query. So here we can make a right click, then new query. And let's add the SQL query that allows us to fill the table with some data. So we can use this query. Let's execute this query. And here we can see that the query is executed correctly. Now let's create a new Razor page that allows us to display the available invoices. So let's create it in the Pages folder. And first let's create a new folder. Let's call it Invoices. Then let's create a new Razor page. and let's call it index.cshtml. Then we will go to the code. So we will go to the index model that is associated to this page. So we can make a right click, then view code. Then here we need the constructor that allows us to request the ApplicationDbContext from the service container. So here let's create the constructor and let's request the ApplicationDbContext class. Then let's save it into a field. Then let's create a public field that we can read in the page. So we need a field that allows us to store the list of invoices. So just here, we can create a list of invoice objects and we can call it invoice list. So here we have this error, so we need just to add the namespace. Then in the onGet method, we need to read the invoices using the ApplicationDbContext, and we need to store them in this list. So we can call context.invoices, which is the name of the table in the database, .toList. And to display the newest invoices first, just here, we can add .order by descending. Now let's display the list of invoices in the page. So we can make a right click, then go to page. Then let's add the title of the page. So we can display the text invoices and we can display it in the center of the page. And here we have the new invoice button. So we can see that it is a bootstrap button and it will take us to the URL /invoices/create. So later we need to create a razor page called create. So here we can see that we are using this tag helper. We can use either this tag helper or we can use the default href attribute. Then let's create a table. So we can add this table. In the table head, we have these columns. So in the action column, we will display two buttons, the edit button and the delete button. And here we have the table body. So for the moment, it is empty. And for every invoice that we have in the invoice list, we need to create a new table row. So just here, we will write some C# code. So we need to write @ for each. So to access the invoice list that is defined in the index model, we need to use the model property. Then for every invoice that we have in this list, we need to create a new table row. So we will create this table row. In the first cell, we will display the invoice ID. Then we will display the number, then the status, then the client name. And here we will display the total price. So we can multiply the quantity by the unit price. And we can add this character. Then we will display the issue date, the due date, and in this cell we will display two buttons. This is the edit button and this is the delete button. So when we click on edit, we will send a request to the edit page. So here we can use this tag helper and we need to provide this page with the invoice ID. So we can use this tag helper and we can add ID, which is the name of the parameter that will be submitted to this page. So we will send a parameter called ID, which is equal to the invoice ID. So this page does not exist for the moment, and later we need to create it in the invoices folder. Then we have the delete button that will send a request to the page delete and will provide it with a parameter called ID, which is the invoice ID. Then let's create a link to this page in the navbar. So let's go to the shared folder. Then let's open the layout file. So this file contains the layout of the application. And here we have the navbar. So we can see that we have this UL element that contains two items. This is the first item, which is the home item. And this is the second item, and it is the privacy item. So we can copy the home item. Let's paste it here. Then let's change the text and we can write invoices. Then let's provide the URL of the page. So it is available in the invoices folder and it is called index. Now let's save all the files, but we don't need this file. Let's save all the files and let's run the application. And we obtain this application. So here we can see that we have the invoices item. Let's click on it. And here we have the different invoices. Now I will show you how to create invoices. So first we need to create a model that we will associate to the form. So let's create a new class in the models folder. And let's call it InvoiceDto. So this model will be very similar to the invoice model. So we need all the properties except the ID property. So we need the invoice number and it is required. We need the states, it is also required. Then we have the issue date and the due date, which are optional. Then we have the service name, which is required. Then we have the unit price. So the value of the unit price should be in this range. And if it is not in this range, then we can display this error message. Then we have the quantity and it should be in this range. Then we have the client name, so it is required. And if we don't provide the client name, then we can display this error message. Then we have the email address, so it is required and it should have the email address format. Then the phone number should be a valid phone number. And finally, we have the address. Now let's create the create page. So when we click on the button new invoice, we will go to the create page that should be available in the invoices folder. So now we need to create this page. So let's create it in the invoices folder. And let's call it create. Then let's go to the model. So we can make a right click, then view code. Then here we need to create a property that we will associate to the form. So we need to create a property of type InvoiceDto and it should be public. And to be able to bind this property to the form, we need to decorate it with the bind property attribute. Then let's create the form and let's bind this property to the form. So first we can display the title new invoice, then let's create the form. So this form will be submitted using the post method. Then let's create a row with 2 columns. So we can create this row that contains 2 columns. This is the first column and this is the second one. Then in the first column we can create a bootstrap CRUD. So here we have a bootstrap CRUD. So we can see that we are using the CRUD class. And we can use this bootstrap class to allow this CRUD to take the full height of the column. Then we have the title of the CRUD. So we can write invoice details. And in the body we can display the form. So we can create this row. It has a label with the text invoice number and we have this input field and it is associated to the number property of InvoiceDto. So InvoiceDto that we have here is this property. Then we have a span to display any validation error. So if we have any validation error related to the invoice number, then we will display it in this span using the red color. Then we have this row, so in the label we will display the text payment states. Then we have a select element that is associated to the states property of InvoiceDto. So in this select element we have 2 options, pending and paid. So the invoice states can be either pending or paid. Then we have a span to display any validation error related to the invoice states. Then we can create this row, so in the label we can display the text issue date. Then we have this input field that is associated to the issue date of InvoiceDto, and the type of this input is date. Then we have another row for the due date. So the input field is associated to due date and the type is date. Then we have a span to display any validation error. Now let's create another bootstrap CRUD in the second column. So we can create this CRUD in the head we can display the text client details, and in the body we can add some fields. So we can add this row. In the label we can display the text client, and we have this input field that is associated to the client name. And of course we have this span for the validation errors. Then we have this row. In the label we have email, and we have this input field that is associated to the email property. Then we have this row, so in the label we have phone, and we have this input field for the phone number. And finally we have this row, so in the label we have the text address, and the input field is associated to the address property of InvoiceDto. So after the two cards, we can create a third card, but we will create it outside of the row. So just here, we can create another card. So we can create this card, and it will be used to display the service details. So in the card header, we will display the text service details, and then we have the card body. So here we will create additional input fields. So we can create this row that contains 4 columns. This is the first column, then we have this column, this is the third column, and this is the last column. So in the first column we have a label with the text service, and we have this input field that is associated to the service property of InvoiceDto. Then in the second column we have a label with the text quantity, and it is associated to the quantity property. We have this column that has a label with the text unit price, and the input field is associated to the unit price property. And finally we have this column. So in the label we have the text total price, and we have this input field where we will display the total price. So in this input field we need to multiply the quantity by the unit price, and we need to display the total price. We can do this later. Now let's add 2 buttons, the submit button and the cancel button. So after the last card we can create the 2 buttons. So this is the submit button, and it allows us to submit the form. We can see that the type here is submit. And this is the cancel button. So when we click on cancel, we will go to the list of invoices. Let's run the application. Let's click on new invoice, and we obtain this page. So we have this row that contains 2 columns. In the first column we have this card that will be used to display the invoice details, and then we have this card for the client details. And this is the last card, so it will be used for the service details. So when we update the quantity and the unit price, we need to display the total price. We can do this using a JavaScript function. So to display the total price in this input field, we need to provide this input field with an ID. We can give it the ID total price input. Then we need to read the quantity and the unit price. So we need to provide this input field with an ID, and we have to do the same thing with this input field. So here we can add the ID quantity input. And here we can use the ID unit price input. Then let's create a JavaScript function. So we need to create the script element, then we can define a new JavaScript function called update total price. So in this method we will read the quantity from the input field having the ID quantity input. Then we will read the unit price from the input field having the ID unit price input. Then we will check if we have a valid quantity and a valid unit price. So if the quantity is not a number or the unit price is not a number, then we can display the value 0 in the input field having the ID total price input. Otherwise, we will calculate the total price. So else means that the quantity and the unit price are valid. So we can multiply the quantity by the unit price, so we will obtain the total price, and we can display the total price in the input field having the ID total price input, which is this input field. Then we need to call this method. When we update the quantity, and when we update the unit price. So just here, we can add the attribute on input and we can call the method update total price. So each time we update the quantity, we will call this method. And we have to do the same thing with this input that displays the unit price. Also, we need to call this method when we display the page. So let's copy the name of the method and let's call it here. Let's run the application. So let's provide the quantity and the unit price. And here we have the total price. Let's update the quantity. And we can see that the total price is updated as well. So if we click on cancel, we have the list of the invoices. And if we click on submit, we have the validation errors. So now we need to create the onPost method that will handle the post requests. So let's go to the create module. We can make a right click, then view code. And here let's create the onPost method. So first let's check if the submitted data is valid or not. So if the model state is not valid, this means that the submitted data is not valid. In this case, we need to exit this method. Otherwise, we need to create a new invoice and we need to save it in the database. So we need to request the ApplicationDbContext from the service container. So here let's create the constructor and let's request the ApplicationDbContext. Then let's save it into a field. Then in the onPost method, we need to create a variable of type invoice using the submitted data that is available in the property InvoiceDto. So we can create this variable of type invoice and we can set the different properties using the submitted data of InvoiceDto. Then we need to save this variable in the database. So we need to call context.invoices and we will add this new invoice. Then we need to save the modifications and we need to redirect the user to the list of invoices. So we can call a return redirect to page and we will redirect the user to this page. So here we have an error. To fix it, we have to replace void with iActionResult. Then we have here another error. So just here we have to add a return page. Let's run the application. Let's create a new invoice. Then let's fill the form. Then submit. So here we can see that we have this invoice and we are redirected to the list of invoices. Now let's create the page that allows us to update the invoice details. So we need to create the edit page in the invoices folder. Then let's go to the code. Then let's create the constructor and let's request the ApplicationDbContext. Let's save it into a field. Then let's create a property of type InvoiceDto that we will associate to the form. Then let's create another property of type invoice that will be used to store the invoice details. Then in the onGet method, we need to read the invoice ID from the URL. So here we can see that we will add a parameter called ID to the URL, which is the invoice ID, and we need to read the value of this parameter. So in the onGet method, we need to create a parameter of type integer and we need to call it ID. Then let's read the invoice having this ID from the database. So here let's create a variable. We can call it invoice and it is equal to context.invoices.find and we need to find the invoice by ID. So this is the invoice ID that we have just here. So if invoice is null, this means that we don't have any invoice with this ID. In this case, we can redirect the user to the list of invoices. But here we have an error, so we need to replace void with IActionResult. Otherwise, if invoice is not null, then we need to save this invoice into this property. Then we will use this invoice to fill the InvoiceDto property. So we will initialize InvoiceDto using the data of the invoice that we have just here. And finally, we need to return the page. So like this, the page will have access to InvoiceDto and to invoice. So invoice will be used to access to the invoice ID. Now let's update the page. So the edit page will be very similar to the create page. So let's go to the create page and let's copy all the code. So we will not copy this line, but we need to copy all the HTML code. And let's save it here. So here we can write edit invoice. And in the first card where we have the invoice details, we can display the invoice ID. So we can copy this row and let's paste it here. Then here we will display the invoice ID. So we don't need to bind this input to any property, so we can delete this. And we need to create a read-only input, so let's add read-only. Then let's add the value. So the value will be available in the invoice property that we have just here. So here we have to write @model.invoice.id. And we don't need this span, so let's delete it. And also let's update the bootstrap class. So here let's write -plain text. Let's run the application. Let's see the details of the invoice with this ID. So let's click on edit and we obtain this page. So here we can see that we have the invoice details. Now let's implement the onPost method that will handle the post request. So let's go to the edit model class and let's create the onPost method. So in the onPost method, we need to read the invoice ID from the URL. Then we need to read the invoice from the database. If the invoice is null, then we will redirect the user to the list of invoices. Otherwise, we will save this invoice to the invoice property. Like this, it will be accessible to the page. Then we will check if the submitted data is valid or not. So if the submitted data is not valid, then we will return the page. Otherwise, we need to update the details of this invoice. So we will update the data of this invoice using the submitted data that is available in InvoiceDto, and then we will save the modifications in the database. And finally, we will display the page. We can also display a success message. So just here, we can save the message invoice updated successfully in this variable. But here we have this error because we don't have this variable, so we need to create it. We can create it just here. Now let's update the page and let's display the success message if it is not empty. So just after the title, we can check if we have the success message or not. So if the success message is not empty, then we can display this bootstrap alert of type success, and here we have the success message. Let's run the application. Then let's update the invoice with this ID. So I will update the states and the quantity. So here let's change the states. And let's increase the quantity. Let's click on submit. And we obtain this success message. Let's go back to the list of invoices. So here we can see that we have a new states and we have a new price. Now I will show you how to delete invoices. So when we click on the delete button, we will go to the delete page and we will provide it with a parameter called ID, which is the invoice ID. So now let's create this page. We don't need to change the page, so let's go to the code. And here in the onGet method, we need to read the invoice ID. So let's add a parameter called ID. And to be able to delete the invoice with this ID, we need the ApplicationDbContext. So let's create the constructor. And let's request the ApplicationDbContext. Let's save it into a field. Then let's update the onGet method. So in this method, we will read the invoice having this ID. If the invoice is not null, then we will delete it. So we can call context.invoices.remove and we will delete this invoice. Then we need to save the modifications and finally we will redirect the user to the list of invoices. So we have this error, so we need to replace void with iActionResult. Let's run the application. Then let's delete the invoice with the ID 40. So here we can see that the invoice with the ID 40 has been deleted and we are redirected to the list of invoices. In the next video, I will show you how to add pagination and search using JavaScript. And I will show you how to display alerts before deleting invoices. Then I will show you how to create invoices with multiple items. And I will show you how to use Entity Framework relationships. So I will show you how to use the one-to-one and the one-to-many relationships. You can find the video link in the description.